The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that could only be found deep within the dense woods, far from the bustling sounds of the world. A thick mist hung low among the trees, casting everything in a pale, ethereal light. The towering oaks and ancient pines reached up to the heavens, their thick branches swaying gently in the breeze. The ground was soft with moss and old leaves, and the air was rich with the earthy scent of damp soil. The river nearby murmured softly, its flow slow and steady, like a lullaby for the creatures of the forest. Among the shadows of this misty forest, a figure moved carefully, its heavy paws making little sound against the soft earth. Bruno, a massive bear, the embodiment of strength, moved cautiously through the trees. His fur, dark and thick, blended with the shadows as he padded silently through the underbrush. He was a creature of the wild, large enough to make even the bravest animal think twice before crossing his path. Yet despite his imposing figure, there was an air of solitude that surrounded him, a solitude that had become his constant companion over the years. Bruno had been part of the forest for as long as he could remember. His early years had been filled with the sounds of his family, his mother, his siblings, the playful sounds of their laughter, and the comforting warmth of their company. They had roamed the forest together, hunting and foraging, living a life full of shared moments. But all that had changed one fateful day. The memory of that loss was still raw. His family, once so vibrant and full of life, had been taken by a sudden tragedy that left Bruno alone in the world. The memories of that day haunted him, the sight of his mother's protective eyes, the sound of his siblings' playful growls, now replaced by silence. Since then, Bruno had retreated deep into the heart of the forest, far from any sign of other creatures. He had built a life alone, tucked away in a cave at the edge of the forest, far from the places where humans and other animals roamed. In his solitude, he had learned to survive. He had become a master fisherman, catching salmon from the river with ease, his strong paws easily navigating the fast-moving waters. His cave, sheltered beneath the roots of an ancient oak, provided a warm and safe place to rest after long days spent wandering the woods. In the quiet of the cave, Bruno would sometimes close his eyes and listen to the rhythm of the forest, the distant calls of the owls, the rustling of the leaves, and the murmurs of the river. It was peaceful here, his home, the only home he had ever known. Yet despite the comfort of the forest and the rhythmic routine of his days, there was an emptiness inside him. It was a quiet ache, something he couldn't quite name, a longing for something he couldn't have. He had learned to push it aside, to focus on the practical things: food, shelter, survival. But the ache always lingered beneath the surface, growing stronger as the days passed. Bruno wandered the forest, his paws leaving deep prints in the soft earth. He would pause occasionally to fish from the river or to find a patch of berries, but his heart was never fully in it. The forest was vast, and though it was filled with life, he always felt a disconnect. He had once known the warmth of family, of shared moments, but that world seemed so far away now. He didn't want to admit it, but the solitude had become a burden. There were days when he would sit by the river, watching the water flow past him, and he would feel an overwhelming sense of loneliness. The other animals, the deer, the wolves, the birds, they were part of the forest's pulse, part of the natural order. But they weren't his family. He had no one to share his world with. He had learned to keep to himself, to avoid getting too close to anyone. He had forgotten how to let anyone in, how to allow himself to be vulnerable, to form a bond. And so each day he wandered the forest alone. The days blended together, one after the other. Bruno had found solace in the solitude of the wild, but deep down, he knew there was something missing. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he felt incomplete. The forest was always the same, with its quiet beauty and its wild rhythms. But Bruno's heart, though strong, carried a weight that couldn't be lifted by fishing, hunting, or wandering. It was a weight that only connection, true, deep connection, could soothe. Yet Bruno had closed himself off from it, and though he was content in his solitude, a quiet voice in the back of his mind whispered that he was meant for something more. As the day turned into evening, and the soft light of dusk began to descend over the forest. Bruno made his way back to his cave, his mind heavy with thoughts of loneliness. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. He gazed out into the vastness of the forest, the same forest that had been his home for so long. Tonight, though, something felt different. A change was in the air. He could feel it in the rustle of the leaves, in the quiet whispers of the wind. Little did he know this night would mark the beginning of something that would change his life forever. The next morning, Bruno awoke to the soft sounds of the forest. The air was crisp with the first touch of autumn, and the leaves were beginning to turn shades of amber and gold. It was a peaceful day, one that seemed as if it would blend seamlessly into the others. But something stirred within the forest, a subtle shift, something Bruno couldn't quite place. He stretched his limbs and padded out of his cave, the morning sunlight filtering through the canopy, casting long, dappled shadows across the ground. The familiar scent of pine and fresh earth filled the air, but today there was an unfamiliar note in the breeze, a new presence, something different. Bruno stopped in his tracks, sniffing the air. His sharp nose caught a faint, sweet scent, something he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't food, it wasn't a predator. It was something gentler, something lighter. He followed the scent, his paws moving silently through the underbrush. The forest seemed unusually quiet, the usual chatter of birds and rustling of small animals muted, as if the very trees were holding their breath. Bruno came to a small clearing near the river, where the sun streamed through the branches in golden shafts, illuminating the soft mist that hung in the air. There, perched on a low branch of an oak tree, was a small bird. Its feathers shimmered like sunlight against the sky, golden and bright, the soft feathers glowing in the early light. The bird tilted its head, its beady eyes locking with Bruno's. At first, Bruno froze. Birds were common in the forest, but none so striking, none so bold. This one was different. It wasn't flapping or chirping nervously. Instead, it simply sat there, watching him with an air of calm curiosity. Bruno took a cautious step forward, unsure what to make of the bird's stillness. He was used to other animals keeping their distance from him, but this one wasn't afraid. The bird, noticing Bruno's gaze, tilted its head to one side. With a small hop, it fluttered down from the branch, landing gracefully on the ground just a few feet away from the bear. It wasn't afraid. In fact, the bird seemed entirely unconcerned by Bruno's presence, as though it had seen bears before, or perhaps in some strange way trusted him. Bruno, though surprised by the bird's calmness, couldn't help but feel an odd connection to it. He had lived alone for so long, surrounded by creatures of the forest who avoided him or feared him. But this bird, this tiny, delicate creature, seemed to be offering him something he hadn't felt in a long time, a chance at connection. For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, the only sound the gentle rustling of the trees and the soft gurgling of the river nearby. Bruno was still unsure, his instincts telling him to stay distant, but there was something in the bird's gaze, something that made him pause. Then, to his surprise, the bird spoke. "Hello there, big fellow." Bruno blinked in disbelief. He had heard many sounds in the forest, but never had he heard a bird speak in such a way. It wasn't the typical chirping or whistling. It was a clear, almost musical voice, calm and inviting. "What? What did you say?" Bruno grumbled, his voice low and deep, as if he couldn't quite comprehend the words. The bird fluttered its wings, hopping a little closer to him. "I said hello, bear. I'm Ruby." Bruno blinked again. Ruby? The name was strange coming from such a small creature, but somehow it seemed to fit. "Ruby, you talk?" Bruno asked, his voice full of confusion, yet curiosity. Ruby tilted her head again, looking up at the towering bear with a spark of amusement in her eyes. "I do more than talk, my friend." She ruffled her feathers, as if proud of her abilities. "I can sing, I can fly, and I can keep you company, if you'd like." Bruno stood still, processing this strange turn of events. A bird that talked, that willingly approached him. No animal had ever done that. His whole life, he had learned to keep to himself, to rely only on his own strength and instincts. But here was Ruby, a tiny creature, offering him something he hadn't known he needed: companionship. Ruby, sensing Bruno's uncertainty, flapped her wings and soared gracefully into the air, flying in circles above him before landing back on the ground. I can tell you're a bit of a loner, Big Bear, but everyone needs a little company now and then. Bruno was taken aback. He had never thought of it that way. He had always believed that solitude was his only option, that it was his way of surviving. But this small, vibrant bird seemed to believe otherwise. I don't need anyone, Bruno said quietly, though there was a hint of hesitation in his voice. I'm fine on my own. Ruby studied him with her keen eyes, not as a predator might, but with something softer, something that showed understanding. It's okay to be alone sometimes, but it's also okay to let someone in. She tilted her head again, as if reading his thoughts. I can help with that, if you'll let me. Bruno felt a strange warmth in his chest, but he pushed it down. He was used to being alone, to not needing anyone. And yet, there was something about Ruby's words, the gentle way she looked at him, that made him wonder if he had been wrong all this time. Could it be that he didn't need to be alone anymore? Ruby, sensing his inner conflict, hopped a few steps closer to Bruno, her wings fluttering lightly. I'm not asking you to change your life, Bear. I'm just offering you a little company, a little companionship. Bruno stood in the quiet of the forest, his massive frame dwarfing the little bird. He was unsure, hesitant, and yet something about Ruby's presence made him feel less alone. Maybe, just maybe, it was worth trying something new. He let out a deep sigh, lowering his head to Ruby's level. All right, you can stay for a while. Ruby chirped happily, fluttering around Bruno in circles. You won't regret it, Bear. I'll show you things you've never seen before. And so, in that small clearing by the river, amidst the towering trees and the soft hum of the forest, a new friendship began, one that was as unexpected as it was powerful. Chapter 3. Unlikely Allies. As the days passed, the forest became a place of new discovery for Bruno. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. Ruby, small and sprightly, followed him everywhere, her golden feathers catching the light as she flitted from tree to tree. At first, Bruno wasn't entirely sure how to feel about this. He had spent so long in solitude that having someone, especially a small, chatty bird, around felt foreign. But Ruby's light-hearted nature was hard to resist. She had an energy about her, a joy for life that seemed to pull Bruno out of the dark places in his heart. Ruby, in turn, found Bruno to be a fascinating companion. Though he was big and imposing, there was a gentleness to him. Bruno's size often intimidated other creatures, but Ruby, never one to be intimidated, had no such qualms. Her days were filled with little adventures, flying over the treetops, picking berries, and even stealing a few sips from the river. Bruno, though quieter and more reserved, was always nearby, his keen eyes watching over her. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Ruby perched on a branch overlooking the forest. She gazed at Bruno, who was below, his large form moving silently through the underbrush, searching for food. You know, Bruno, you're not so bad for a bear, Ruby called down to him, her voice light and teasing. Bruno paused, lifting his head to look up at her. His deep-set eyes met hers, and for a moment he seemed puzzled. I'm not bad at all, Ruby. I'm just me. Ruby fluttered down beside him, hopping onto a nearby rock. Exactly. You're just you, and I think that's pretty amazing. She tilted her head and added, I'm glad you're letting me stick around. Bruno snorted softly, not used to compliments, especially from a bird. I guess I'm getting used to your chatter. Ruby grinned. Hey, we birds are known for our chatter. They both shared a quiet moment as the evening settled in. The forest around them seemed to sigh with the evening breeze. Bruno felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. But their newfound tranquility was soon interrupted. A loud crash broke the peaceful silence of the forest. The ground beneath them trembled as something large and heavy moved through the trees, snapping branches with terrifying force. Bruno's head snapped up in alarm, his body tensing. Ruby, who had been perched on a branch, immediately flew to Bruno's side. "What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Bruno's keen senses immediately went on high alert. He could smell it before he saw it. A wolf. But not just any wolf. This one smelled of aggression, of hunger. It wasn't just one wolf. There was a pack moving through the forest, and they were closing in quickly. Ruby's small body fluttered in the air beside Bruno, her wings trembling. She had seen wolves before, but never this close. "Are they coming for us?" she asked nervously. Bruno, though alarmed, stood tall. He knew the forest well. He knew wolves. He had faced them before in his younger years. Wolves were cunning, but they were no match for a bear of his size. He stood firm, his muscles tense, ready to defend himself and Ruby if necessary. Suddenly, the leader of the pack appeared, a large gray wolf with piercing yellow eyes. The wolf's gaze locked onto Bruno, and a low growl rumbled from its throat. Behind him, a few more wolves emerged from the underbrush, surrounding Bruno and Ruby. Ruby's heart raced. She could see the pack's intent. They were calculating, moving in slowly, as wolves do when they're ready to strike. But something inside her told her to stay close to Bruno. Bruno growled in warning, but he didn't move. The last thing he wanted was to fight, especially in a situation where there were too many wolves. But he couldn't allow Ruby to be hurt. "Stay behind me, Ruby," he muttered under his breath. Ruby's small body fluttered nervously, but she nodded. She trusted Bruno more than she had ever trusted anyone. She watched as the wolves circled, their sharp teeth glinting in the fading light. The lead wolf took another step forward, its growl becoming more intense. Bruno, sensing the danger, took a deep breath, his massive form towering over the wolves. He stood his ground. But just as the wolf lunged forward, Ruby sprang into action. With an agility that took Bruno by surprise, Ruby swooped down low and dove straight at the wolf's eyes, distracting it with a flurry of movement. The wolf, startled and confused by the sudden attack from the tiny bird, hesitated for a moment. Bruno seized the opportunity, charging forward with all his strength, slamming into the lead wolf and knocking it back. Ruby, still darting around the pack, swooped in and pecked at another wolf, her sharp beak nipping at the wolf's fur. Her swift, unpredictable movements confused the pack, and Bruno used this to his advantage, pushing them back with powerful swipes of his massive paws. "Bruno, now!" Ruby shouted from above. Bruno let out a mighty roar that echoed through the trees, shaking the forest with its power. The wolves, startled and intimidated by the bear's ferocity, began to retreat. One by one, they turned and fled into the woods, their tails between their legs. The leader of the pack, now nursing its wounds, hesitated for a moment before retreating into the shadows, its yellow eyes watching them warily. As the wolves disappeared into the forest, Bruno stood panting, his body heaving with effort. He was bruised, but not badly hurt. His eyes scanned the clearing, making sure the danger had passed. Once he was sure, he let out a heavy sigh. Ruby landed gracefully on a nearby rock, her wings still fluttering from the rush of adrenaline. "Well, that was exciting, wasn't it?" Bruno turned to look at her, a slow smile creeping across his face. "Exciting? Ruby, you just saved both of us." Ruby puffed out her chest, clearly pleased with herself. "I did my part, big guy. You did the heavy lifting." Bruno chuckled softly. "I think you did more than your part. You were brave, little bird." Ruby grinned, her golden feathers shimmering in the sunlight. "Bravery doesn't have a size, does it?" Bruno shook his head, marveling at how someone so small could have so much courage. He had never experienced a bond like this before. This shared sense of trust, of mutual respect. "You were right, Ruby," Bruno said quietly. "Maybe I didn't need to be alone after all." Ruby perched on his shoulder, and for the first time, Bruno felt a warm glow of happiness in his chest. He wasn't alone anymore, not with Ruby by his side. After the encounter with the wolves, Bruno and Ruby's bond grew stronger each day. The forest, once a place of solitude for Bruno, began to feel more like a home with Ruby by his side. They spent their days exploring the vast woods, fishing in the river, and talking about everything and nothing. Bruno, who had once feared closeness, now found comfort in Ruby's company. And Ruby, who had always flown alone, learned to enjoy the slow, steady pace of the earth beneath her. Bruno had never considered that he might need companionship, but now with Ruby by his side, he realized how much he had missed the simple joys of connection. He found himself listening to her stories about the other parts of the forest she had visited, and in return, he shared tales of his past, his family, his years spent alone, and the wisdom he had gained from surviving in the wild. Ruby, for her part, was fascinated by Bruno's strength and his deep connection to the forest. She loved hearing about the ancient trees, the secret caves, and the hidden places Bruno knew. She would sit on his shoulder as he showed her his favorite spots, and together they'd watch the sunset over the river, their silhouettes casting long shadows on the soft earth. But even as they grew closer, the forest was never truly without danger. There were still predators, fierce storms, and unforeseen challenges. However, with each passing day, Bruno and Ruby became a team, one that depended on each other's strengths to navigate the wild world around them. One crisp autumn morning, Bruno and Ruby set out to explore the forest's northern edge. The leaves had begun to fall, blanketing the ground in vibrant hues of red and orange. There was a particular patch of wild berries that Bruno loved, and Ruby had insisted on joining him to gather them. They made their way through the thick underbrush, Ruby flitting from tree to tree, while Bruno lumbered steadily on the forest floor. The sun was high in the sky when they reached the berry patch, a small clearing surrounded by thickets of bramble and low-growing shrubs. Bruno bent down to sample the berries, enjoying their sweet taste. Ruby, ever the enthusiastic companion, fluttered around, plucking the ripest berries she could find. The air smelled of earth, and the sounds of the forest were filled with the usual chatter of squirrels and birds. But suddenly the tranquility was shattered. From the edge of the clearing, a low growl broke the silence. Bruno's head shot up, and Ruby froze mid-flight, her wings beating wildly. "Not again," Bruno muttered under his breath. He could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand up as he scanned the surroundings. The growl came again, louder this time, and there was no mistaking it. This was the sound of a predator. Ruby's tiny body fluttered nervously on his shoulder. "What is it?" Bruno's eyes narrowed as he looked in the direction of the sound. "A cougar!" His voice was low and tense. "They're fast, and they strike without warning. We need to be careful." Ruby didn't like the sound of that. "What should we do?" Bruno growled softly, his large body turning to face the dense thicket from which the sound had come. He knew cougars were stealthy, and the forest had taught him that one could never underestimate a predator. "Stay close to me, Ruby. If I tell you to fly, you fly. If I tell you to hide, you hide. We're in this together now." Ruby nodded, her tiny heart racing. She was small and vulnerable compared to Bruno, but she wasn't about to let fear get the best of her. The two of them stood still, eyes scanning the trees, ears twitching at every rustle in the underbrush. And then, without warning, the cougar leaped from the shadows. The cougar, sleek and powerful, landed just a few feet from Bruno. It was larger than Ruby had imagined, its muscles rippling beneath its tawny coat as it crouched, eyes locked onto Bruno. Bruno stood his ground, his massive form blocking Ruby from the cougar's view. Ruby, perched high on Bruno's shoulder, instinctively took flight, darting above the predator's head in an attempt to distract it. The cougar's eyes flicked up to her, its attention momentarily diverted. But the cougar was fast, and Bruno knew that his own size would be the only thing that could give him a fighting chance. With a low roar, Bruno charged the cougar, using his powerful paws to swat at it. The cougar darted to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike. It retaliated with a swipe of its claws, catching Bruno's shoulder. The bear let out a pained growl, but he didn't falter. The pain was nothing compared to the need to protect Ruby. "Get back, Ruby!" Bruno bellowed, his voice filled with urgency. Ruby, her heart pounding in her chest, darted to the trees above them. She knew her small size wouldn't help in a direct confrontation. She had to find a way to help without getting in the way. Bruno and the cougar clashed again, teeth gnashing and claws slashing. Bruno's powerful legs slammed into the ground as he reared up on his hind legs, his large claws reaching for the cougar. The cougar, agile and quick, swerved to avoid the blow and lashed out once more, narrowly missing Bruno's throat. Bruno roared in fury, and with one final burst of strength, he managed to pin the cougar to the ground. It was a brutal, exhausting battle, but Bruno was determined. The cougar, realizing it had no chance against such a powerful opponent, let out a growl of frustration and tried to escape. With one last swipe of its powerful claws, it managed to break free and disappeared into the trees, leaving Bruno panting heavily. Ruby landed softly on a nearby branch, her tiny wings still fluttering from the adrenaline. She watched as Bruno slowly lowered himself to the ground, his chest heaving with effort. A few shallow cuts marred his fur, but nothing too deep. He had fought fiercely and protected her, just as he had promised. Ruby fluttered down to his side, perched on a low branch near his head. "Are you okay?" Bruno let out a low grunt, his eyes tired but determined. "I'll be fine." He looked up at Ruby, his deep brown eyes softening. "I couldn't let that thing hurt you." Ruby's heart swelled with gratitude. "You're incredible, Bruno. I've never seen anything like that. You're a true protector." Bruno chuckled, though it sounded more like a grunt of exhaustion. "I don't need to be incredible, Ruby. I just need to keep you safe." Ruby smiled, her eyes shining with admiration. The bear was right. It wasn't about being powerful. It was about doing whatever it took to protect the ones you cared about. As they sat together in the quiet aftermath of the battle, Bruno realized that he had never felt so alive, so connected to another being. Ruby, small and delicate as she was, had proven that size and strength weren't everything. Her courage, her spirit, and her loyalty were qualities that Bruno cherished more than anything. And as the sun began to set over the forest, the two of them sat together, one small bird, one large bear, bonded by the challenges they had faced and the adventures that still awaited them. In the days that followed their confrontation with the cougar, Bruno and Ruby found a new rhythm in their lives. The bond between them had solidified, and it was clear that their friendship had transformed both of them. For Bruno, it was the first time in years that he had felt a connection so deep, a relationship that was built not on mere survival, but on trust and companionship. For Ruby, the once innocent wanderer had now found a protector, someone she could count on not only for safety, but for genuine connection. The forest had always been Bruno's home, but now it was shared with Ruby. The bear, once a solitary creature, found comfort in the presence of the small bird. Ruby had a different way of seeing the world, one filled with curiosity and playfulness. And Bruno was slowly learning to embrace it. The slow pace of the forest, the way the trees whispered in the wind, the way the sun filtered through the canopy, all took on new meaning as he shared it with Ruby. But their lives in the forest weren't all calm and peace. The wild was never far from danger, and every day was a new challenge, new threats to face, new lessons to learn. One early morning, as the mist still clung to the ground, the two friends set out on what would become their most daring adventure yet. The air was cooler than usual as Bruno and Ruby made their way toward the northern part of the forest, where the land began to rise into a series of tall, craggy mountains. Bruno had always steered clear of these mountains, having heard of the dangers that lurked there, the sharp cliffs, the predators who made their dens high up on the jagged rocks, and the sudden storms that could descend without warning. But Ruby was different. The mountains intrigued her. They were a place of mystery, a land where few had ventured, and Ruby's curiosity got the best of her. As they ventured deeper into the forest, Ruby fluttered excitedly from tree to tree, her golden wings shimmering in the sunlight. "Come on, Bruno. We have to explore the mountains. What could be more exciting than that?" Bruno hesitated. "The mountains are dangerous, Ruby. I've lived in these woods long enough to know that they're not a place for me." His voice was firm, but there was a soft hesitation to it. Bruno had never ventured far beyond his own territory, the one place where he felt safe. Ruby, however, wasn't one to back down. She circled around him, chirping excitedly. "I've heard stories about the mountain peaks, about the caves and the views you can see from up high. It's the perfect adventure, Bruno. You might even find something amazing." Bruno sighed, his massive paws planting firmly on the ground. He had no desire for any more adventures. He had already experienced so much loss, so much hardship, and for years he had chosen the safety of his cave over the unpredictability of the world. But Ruby was so full of life, and her enthusiasm was contagious. Perhaps for once, it was time to push past his fears and see what lay beyond the familiar. All right, Ruby, we'll go. But if things get dangerous, we turn back. Understand? Ruby's wings fluttered in a flurry of excitement. I promise, Bruno, we'll be careful and we'll explore together. And so they began their journey. The journey to the base of the mountains was more difficult than Bruno had anticipated. The forest became denser, the trees taller and thicker, and the air grew colder as they climbed higher. Bruno, though strong, had to push through the thick brambles and overgrown paths, while Ruby flew overhead, scouting the way. The further they went, the more Bruno could feel the weight of the unknown pressing on him. The mountains loomed ahead, towering and imposing, casting long shadows over the land. Every step they took seemed to carry more risk, but Ruby's excitement kept pushing them forward. As the sun began to set, they reached a cliff that overlooked the valley below. The sight was breathtaking, vast expanses of forest, rivers winding through the land, and the silhouette of the distant mountains on the horizon. Ruby landed beside Bruno, her eyes wide with wonder. This is incredible, Bruno! We made it to the top! Bruno gazed out over the landscape, the evening mist settling over the valley below. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly appreciate the view. The world seemed so much larger from up here, so much more beautiful than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just the land he had known for so long. It was something beyond that, something more profound. But their moment of awe was interrupted by a soft rumble beneath their feet. Bruno's eyes widened. Ruby, we need to move. Now! Before Ruby could ask what was wrong, the ground beneath them trembled violently, and a deafening crack echoed through the air. A massive rock slide had begun, sending boulders tumbling down the mountainside. The air was thick with dust and debris, and Bruno quickly turned to Ruby. Fly, he shouted, pushing her toward the open sky. Ruby hesitated for a moment, but then she flapped her wings with all her might, taking to the air just as the first of the boulders crashed where they had been standing moments before. Bruno charged, his large form moving swiftly despite the chaos around him, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he had to get to safety, and he had to make sure Ruby did too. The ground continued to shake as the rock slide raged on, and Bruno ran with all his strength, his powerful legs carrying him up the slope, away from the falling debris. Ruby, now safely above the chaos, circled back to check on him. The dust in the air made it hard for her to see clearly, but she could still spot the bear's silhouette, moving with purpose through the haze. Hurry, Bruno! Ruby called out, her voice strained with worry. Bruno reached a ledge at the side of the mountain, just as the worst of the landslide began to subside. He could feel his heart racing, but his instincts told him to keep moving, keep going. As the last of the rocks tumbled behind him, he turned to face Ruby, who had landed beside him, her wings still trembling from the adrenaline. For a moment they stood in silence, the forest still echoing with the aftermath of the landslide. Bruno looked down at Ruby, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breath. I thought we weren't going to make it, Ruby whispered, her feathers ruffled from the rush. That was too close. Bruno exhaled, his deep voice calm but filled with gratitude. You stayed with me, Ruby. You didn't leave. Thank you. Ruby gave him a small, tired smile. I told you I wouldn't leave you, Bruno. We're a team now. Bruno nodded, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He had taken the risk. He had stepped out of his comfort zone, and he had survived. And in that moment, with Ruby beside him, he realized that the world didn't have to be faced alone. Together they had made it through the worst of the storm, and together they would face whatever came next. They were not just a bear and a bird. They were family, united by the forest and bound by a friendship that had grown stronger with every challenge. The world around Bruno and Ruby had settled into an eerie calm after the chaos of the rock slide. The air was thick with dust and the sound of distant rumblings, but the worst seemed to be over. The mountain had shaken beneath them, its voice booming with the fury of nature. Yet now the forest was strangely silent. Bruno stood at the edge of the cliff, his massive form silhouetted against the pale light of the evening. The forest stretched out below, vast and unyielding. It seemed as though nothing in the world could touch this place, the place that had always been his sanctuary. But even here, in the heart of the wild, the storm had come. Ruby fluttered next to him, her wings beating with a nervous energy. "What now, Bruno?" she asked, her voice small against the stillness. Bruno's gaze swept across the distant treetops. "We keep moving." His voice was calm, though there was an underlying urgency in his tone. "The storm may be over for now, but there are always more dangers in the wild. We need to find shelter for the night." Ruby nodded, her golden feathers glistening in the fading light. She could sense the tension in Bruno, the quiet fear that even he couldn't shake. It wasn't the storm or the landslide that worried him. It was the uncertainty that followed. The forest had changed. The earth had shaken. There was no telling what else lay ahead. As Bruno and Ruby made their way down the mountain, the sky darkened, and the wind began to pick up again. It was a low, ominous hum, like a warning that something greater was coming. The trees groaned in response, their leaves rattling as if whispering their own warnings. Ruby flitted ahead, her sharp eyes scanning the forest for any signs of danger. Bruno, though more grounded, was keenly aware of the shifts around him. His ears pricked at every rustle, every sound. He had learned long ago that the wilderness was never truly still. There was always something lurking, always something watching. After a few hours of walking, they came across a small cave nestled in the side of a rocky hill. It wasn't much, but it would provide shelter from the wind. Bruno paused at the entrance, sniffing the air cautiously. He didn't sense any other animals nearby, so he motioned for Ruby to land. "This will do for tonight," he said, settling down inside. The cave was cool and dry, offering a welcome reprieve from the humid air outside. Ruby perched on a rock just outside the cave, looking up at the sky, her feathers rustling in the breeze. "Bruno, I'm scared," Ruby admitted, her voice trembling for the first time since their adventure had begun. "What if something else happens? What if we're not ready for it?" Bruno, though weary from their journey, looked at the little bird with gentle eyes. "The forest is full of dangers, Ruby, but that's what makes us strong. We've faced so much together already. We've survived." Ruby fluttered her wings, still unsure. "But we're so small compared to everything else out here. What if it's too much?" Bruno's deep voice softened. "We're not as small as you think, Ruby. Together we can face anything. You and me." That night the storm finally arrived. The wind howled through the trees and the skies opened up, sending sheets of rain crashing down. The thunder was loud enough to shake the very ground beneath them, and lightning illuminated the forest in stark, blinding flashes. Bruno and Ruby huddled together in the cave, safe for the moment. But the sound of the storm outside was deafening. The rain pummeled the earth, and the wind howled through the branches of the trees, bending them dangerously close to the ground. "Bruno, do you think the forest can survive this?" Ruby asked, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. Bruno's eyes narrowed as he listened to the sound of the wind whipping through the trees. He had lived through many storms in his lifetime, but this one felt different, stronger, darker. He could feel the power of nature around him, pressing in on him, reminding him of the forces he couldn't control. "The forest will survive, Ruby," Bruno said softly, his voice full of conviction. "It always does." Ruby nestled closer to him, her wings drawn tightly to her sides. She trusted Bruno more than anyone else, but even she could feel the weight of the storm bearing down on them. Outside, the storm raged, and for a long while they remained in the cave, waiting for the worst of it to pass. The sound of the rain on the rocks was rhythmic, almost comforting, but the storm was far from over. The next morning, when the storm had finally subsided and the world outside was quiet once again, Bruno and Ruby ventured out of the cave. The air was heavy with moisture, and the forest smelled fresh and earthy. The sky was overcast and the trees stood tall, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But the tranquility was short-lived. As they made their way down the path, they noticed something strange. The forest was too quiet. No birds chirped, no squirrels scurried through the trees. The usual rustling sounds of the forest had faded. Suddenly, Ruby's sharp eyes caught movement. A large figure emerged from the underbrush, a massive wild boar, its tusks gleaming in the dim light. The boar was charging toward them with alarming speed, its eyes wild with panic. Bruno immediately stepped in front of Ruby, his large body shielding her from the boar's charge. He let out a deep growl, warning the boar to stay back. But the creature didn't stop. It was frightened, disoriented from the storm, and it was charging with reckless abandon. Ruby's heart raced as she saw the boar closing in. "Bruno, move! It's coming right for us!" she shouted. Without hesitation, Bruno lunged forward, his claws swiping through the air as he made contact with the boar's side. The boar grunted in pain, stumbling back a few steps. But it didn't retreat. Instead, it charged again, this time aiming directly for Ruby. "Ruby!" Bruno roared. With incredible speed, Ruby took flight, her wings cutting through the air as she darted above the boar, drawing its attention away from Bruno. The boar, now fixated on the small bird, turned to follow her, allowing Bruno to land a powerful blow. He shoved the boar away, sending it crashing into the thick underbrush. Ruby circled above, her voice filled with urgency. "Bruno, watch out! It's not giving up!" Bruno was now facing the boar head-on, his paws planted firmly in the earth, ready for the next charge. He knew he had to protect Ruby, no matter the cost. The boar charged again, but this time Bruno was ready. With a mighty roar, he swiped at the boar's tusks, knocking the creature off balance. The boar stumbled, and with a final shove, Bruno sent it running into the forest, defeated. Ruby landed beside him, panting. "That was too close. You saved me again." Bruno shook his fur, looking down at Ruby with a soft, almost affectionate gaze. "You helped me too, Ruby. We make a good team." Ruby fluttered her wings, her heart still racing. "I think we've earned some rest after that." Bruno chuckled, the sound deep and rumbling. "Agreed. Let's go find a quiet spot for the night." Together they continued their journey through the forest, now more confident than ever in the strength of their friendship. They had faced the dangers of the wild together and survived. And in that moment, Bruno realized something important. It wasn't just about strength or survival. It was about finding someone to share the journey with, someone to face the storms and challenges of the world by your side. The days following their encounter with the wild boar were filled with quiet moments as Bruno and Ruby made their way through the forest. Despite the dangers they had faced together, there was a growing sense of calm between them. Bruno, once so used to solitude, found comfort in Ruby's constant presence. Her lighthearted chatter, her boundless energy, and her gentle spirit filled a space in his heart he hadn't realized was empty. Ruby, too, had found something unexpected in their relationship. She had always been independent, flying from one place to another, seeking adventure, and never staying in one spot too long. But with Bruno, she had found a home, not a place, but a person. She had learned that adventure didn't always have to be about the destination. Sometimes it was about the journey and who you shared it with. One evening, as they made their way down the path toward the river, Ruby fluttered ahead, her golden wings shimmering in the last rays of the sun. Bruno followed, his heavy footsteps steady and reassuring behind her. The forest was peaceful, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant murmur of the river. "You know, Bruno, I think we've earned some rest, don't you?" Ruby called over her shoulder, her voice light and carefree. Bruno nodded, a soft chuckle rumbling from deep within his chest. "I could use a break, Ruby. After everything we've faced, a little peace sounds good." They reached a small clearing by the river, a quiet, tranquil spot where the water flowed gently over smooth rocks. The sun was low, casting a warm golden glow over the landscape. It was the perfect place to rest. Bruno lay down on the soft grass, stretching his long limbs and letting the warmth of the setting sun wash over him. Ruby, always energetic, fluttered down to a nearby rock, watching the river's current with quiet curiosity. "This is nice, isn't it?" Ruby said, her voice soft as she perched on the rock. "Just the two of us. No more worries for now." Bruno closed his eyes, letting out a deep sigh. He hadn't felt this relaxed in years. Content, safe. The forest had always been his home, but now with Ruby beside him, it felt more like a sanctuary than ever before. Yeah, it is, Bruno replied, his voice gentle. I didn't know how much I needed this. Ruby tilted her head, her golden feathers catching the light. What do you mean? Bruno opened his eyes, looking up at the sky, which was now painted with shades of pink and purple. I've spent so much time alone. I've always thought that I didn't need anyone, that I was better off on my own. But having you here, Ruby, it's made everything feel different. Ruby's heart swelled at Bruno's words. She had always known that he was a strong, independent bear, but hearing him speak so openly, with such vulnerability, touched her deeply. I'm glad, Bruno. I'm glad I'm here with you, Ruby said, her voice filled with warmth. Bruno smiled softly. I'm glad too, Ruby. I think we've both learned a lot from each other. Ruby fluttered down and landed gently beside him, her tiny form perched on the grass next to Bruno's massive paw. I've learned that there's more to life than flying around and looking for adventures. Sometimes the greatest adventure is just being here. She paused, looking up at Bruno with a soft smile. With someone who cares. Bruno's gaze softened, his dark eyes looking down at Ruby with affection. I think I've learned that too. For a long while they sat in silence, watching the sky darken as the stars began to appear one by one, their silvery light reflecting off the water. The forest around them was peaceful, as though it too was taking a deep breath, savoring the quiet after the storm. The only sound was the gentle murmur of the river and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was in this moment of peace that Bruno realized just how far he had come. When he had first met Ruby, he had been a bear defined by solitude, by the pain of his past and the burden of his loneliness. But now, with Ruby by his side, he understood that life could be different. He didn't have to face the wild alone. And Ruby, small and full of life as she was, had shown him that true strength wasn't just in facing the dangers of the forest, it was in the connections we make along the way. As the night grew deeper, and the moonlight bathed the clearing in a silvery glow, Bruno and Ruby settled down to sleep. The forest, once again, was peaceful. But even in the quiet, Bruno could feel that something was coming, something that would test their bond in ways they hadn't yet imagined. Ruby, nestled on a soft patch of moss, closed her eyes, exhausted from the day's journey. Bruno lay nearby, his body stretched out comfortably on the earth, but his mind was restless. The storm had passed, but there was a sense of foreboding in the air, a whisper in the trees that told him the forest wasn't finished with them yet. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the feeling. It had been a hard day, and they had earned this rest. But deep down, he knew that the wild was never truly still. There would always be more challenges, more danger. But with Ruby by his side, he felt ready to face anything. Together they were a force, a team that had already overcome the odds. And whatever came next, Bruno knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't face it alone. The forest had calmed once more. The battle with the shadowed creature, a predator of darkness that had sought to tear apart the bond between Bruno and Ruby, had left its mark, but it had also cemented something deeper. Bruno and Ruby had survived together, a team forged through loyalty and mutual respect. Their journey, filled with peril, had brought them to a place where trust outweighed fear, and together they had proven that even the wildest of beasts and the smallest of birds could stand side by side. Ruby perched on a nearby branch, looking out over the vast expanse of the forest. She had seen so much in her travels, but now she understood the forest in a new way. The towering trees no longer felt intimidating. The wild, with all its dangers, was home. A home she had chosen, a place that had brought her closer to a creature she could never have imagined being friends with. Bruno, though quieter, shared the same feeling. The once solitary bear had found something greater than himself in Ruby, a connection he had thought was lost forever. Together, they had explored the deepest corners of the forest, faced storms and predators, and ultimately found family in each other. The vast wilderness no longer felt like a place to hide from the world. It was a place to belong. But their journey was far from over. The forest had more to teach them, And both Bruno and Ruby had grown in ways they never expected. The forest was not just a backdrop for their adventures. It was their home. And in a way, they had become its protectors. The lessons they had learned together about strength, sacrifice, and love had transformed them both. They had become more than just a bear and a bird. They had become guardians of the wild, protectors of the creatures and the land they had learned to cherish. One crisp autumn morning, as they stood at the edge of the forest, overlooking a valley bathed in the warm light of the rising sun, Ruby turned to Bruno. "I think it's time we did something important, Bruno." Bruno raised an eyebrow, sensing the weight of her words. "What do you mean?" Ruby took a deep breath, her wings fluttering in the cool morning air. "I think it's time we shared our story with the world." Bruno looked at her in confusion. "What do you mean? We've lived quietly here, far from the world. Why share our story?" Ruby smiled gently. "Because our story isn't just ours anymore. It belongs to the forest, to the animals that need to know that there's more to this place than just survival. There's friendship, there's trust, there's a place for everyone, no matter how different they are." Bruno stood still for a moment, letting Ruby's words sink in. She was right. Their journey had been more than just an adventure. It had been a lesson in how the forest could be a place of unity, where even the most unlikely of creatures could find common ground. With a slow nod, Bruno finally spoke, his voice deep but filled with a rare warmth. "I agree, Ruby. We have a story to tell.